I just wanted to welcome you all to In Conversation, Collecting and Connoisseurship. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claire Whitner. I'm the Assistant Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Senior Curator of Collections here at the Davis Museum. In 2016, we received the extraordinary collection of roughly 250 prints assembled by Ann Kirk Warren, who graduated from Wellesley College in 1950. Warren studied English at Wellesley and went on to pursue advanced degrees in English and art history at Wayne State University in Detroit, and really was just a lover and patron of the arts for the entirety of her life. During which time, and throughout really her whole life, she collected prints. And her tastes and interests were wide-ranging. When we first received these portfolios of prints at the Davis Museum, we couldn't stop exclaiming at one beautiful impression after another, but that we saw prints by Goltzius, we saw prints by Lovis Courant, we saw work by Beckmann, really from the 16th century up to the 20th century, that she really collected widely and seemed to have an all-embracing love of printmaking. Variety of techniques. It was really exciting to see, and really for us that was, it was profoundly impact what we are able to show in our collections, because she was able to give us depth in so many different areas of our prints collection, and so really to sort of honor her magnanimity and her generosity. We convened this panel today to explore the world of collecting works on paper and what it means to sort of live with works on paper and to live with prints and drawings and to work with prints and drawings. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel who have all very much engaged deeply with works on paper, some drawings, some with prints and drawings. So our first panel member, I'll move sort of from this side to this side, is George Abrams. George Abrams developed with his late wife, Maida, an internationally renowned collection of Dutch Golden Age drawings. He spent his professional career as a corporate attorney in the firm of Weiner and Abrams in Boston. He serves as a trustee at the MFA Boston and is a member of Harvard Art Museum's visiting committee. He's also served as a member of the board and as well as chairman of the Prints and Drawings Vetting Committee at the European Fine Arts Fair, TEFAF, in Maastricht. And he has lent and given drawings and prints to many institutions. In 1991, he gave a major gift of Dutch drawings to Harvard Art Museums, making them the strongest collection in this area in the country. And he's also given, actually generously, to the Davis Museum as well. And he actually, as he was pointing out, one of the very first show of his collection was actually here on campus at Wellesley College. So very exciting to have him back. Our next panelist is Susan Schulman. Susan Schulman received her master's from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, and she has worked as a specialist in fine prints since 1982. She serves as a member of the visiting committee for the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she is director at large for the Association of Print Scholars, as well as a member of Sanoa and Art Table. Susan Schulman has been a longtime friend of the Davis and has facilitated the bequest of Ann Kirk Warren's print collection to the museum, and for that we are deeply grateful. And last but not least, probably a familiar face to many of you, Elizabeth Wyckoff. Elizabeth received her PhD from Columbia University with a dissertation on printmaking in Harlem in the 1620s. She's worked as a curator of prints and drawings at several institutions, at the New York Public Library, at the Davis Museum, where she was also the assistant director for curatorial affairs. And she's now the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the St. Louis Art Museum. She's worked on exhibitions featuring prints and drawings from the early modern period up to the present. And she's currently working on an exhibition and catalog of post-1945 American prints in the St. Louis collections. So we welcome you all. As you see, these are people that have really thought hard about works on paper and have a lot of experience sort of working with them, loving them, being challenged by them. And so what I'm hoping is that we'll really be able to learn a lot from their experiences. To begin, I just wanted to get a sense of sort of where your passion for works on paper come from. And I will start with George and then Susan and Elizabeth. But I think, George, in terms of collecting, what is the genesis of your interest in works on paper and what motivated you and made it to start collecting?
Well, in the second year of my time at Harvard Law School, I got a call from a Harvard dean I knew fairly well and said, how would you like to work in Holland this summer? And I said, no, I got to work for a law firm. We're supposed to be serious. And he said, this is a good opportunity. And he sent down 2 students and a government official, and they told me they would like me to put out a newspaper on one of the Dutch ships and work on student tours with them, and I could be paid for that. I could be in Leiden and spend the summer there, and I decided I would be irresponsible, and I didn't go work in a law firm that summer, and went to Holland and started wandering around Dutch museums, and I really fell in love with Dutch art. When I got out of law school, I represented a number of artists immediately, and their names that are fairly well known around here, Hyman Bloom and Harold Tovish, and I represented Hyman Swetzoff, who was a dealer in Boston who loved old master drawings personally, not as a business aspect. And when my wife and I got married, Hyman was a regular companion at dinners and other things that we would spend time. And he really taught us a lot early so that we avoided the difficult pitfalls of making mistakes, perhaps lots of mistakes, and that discourages people. And we ended up having a lot of knowledge very early in our collecting. We kind of drifted to drawings because we felt they were closer to what the artist was thinking, and they weren't as planned, and they were less expensive. And we were just married, and we were kind of worrying about spending money on things that my father or other people didn't think were a good idea. In any event, we took a trip to London, Amsterdam, and Paris, and we had outlined all the dealers that you could think of. We had help in getting the list. And I can still remember we went into London. It was a dealer who later became a good friend. We went into his gallery and told him we were interested in Dutch drawings. And he put us in a little room, and he had a lot of Dutch drawings. And he gave us some grapes, and we started looking at them.
With your sticky fingers.
With sticky fingers, but he gave us things to. And I can still remember I picked up a small drawing by Jan van Goyen, a very wonderful Dutch artist of the 17th century, pen and ink, this big. And I held it in my hand, and it was in good condition. I looked at it, and I thought to myself, this was done 350 years ago. It's a little piece of paper, and it's wonderful. And how could it have survived? And I thought, well, people have cherished it. And it did survive. And it's a miracle as far as I was concerned. I remember at that point I was really taken by it. Now, it happened, I brought that drawing with me tonight. I still have it, but here it is. And you can see it fits in the palm of your hand. And if you look at it, you can see people and horses and a pond and boats. And now it's 400 years old. And you can see how maybe that would have an impact. Not on everybody. It's you almost have to be open to it, and maybe you have to be a collector type. But for some people, it's magic, and works on paper are really magical, perhaps more so than paintings. to a drawing collector. But this is how it all started, and we went on from there.
Did you anticipate that your collection would become as large as it has, or did you at that point just see yourself buying a nice drawing for yourselves, and that was it?
We really didn't anticipate anything. We weren't thinking of ourselves as collectors. What we were thinking was this was wonderful, and we saw a group of others. We traveled around that summer. I made a list of 20 drawings that I thought were wonderful. And in those days, you could really find good things, and they weren't expensive, and there was almost no competition. It was kind of a paradise. We didn't know it at the time, but and I still have that list. I wish I'd bought all 20. They were extraordinary, and they were doable. But we were just buying things we loved, and we loved them more than cars. We drove around in a 12, 13-year-old car. My wife never had a fur coat because every time we went to get something like that, we were thinking we could buy a drawing if we could. And at some point, we knew we had quite a few very good things, and that's when Wellesley came into the picture. Teaching at Wellesley was Franklin Robinson, who was a graduate of Harvard, a PhD in Dutch art. And the director of the museum was Margaret Robinson. And they used to come visit, Franklin particularly, to see the drawings. And they decided they wanted us to do an exhibition. We resisted it. But in fact, we eventually did our very first exhibition at Wellesley College, and Frank did a beautiful catalog. This is the catalog. Small, nice catalog, and it has 65 drawings in it. And Frank did a very scholarly job. And it was exhibited in Wellesley, and we looked around, we were surprised. It looked pretty good, and we never realized quite what we'd done, but it got a very good response. It went on to 6 museums. It went to Princeton, it went to Rhode Island School of Design, the Ringling Museum, University of Connecticut, Dartmouth. And it was the first exhibition of drawings of this nature in this country. They'd been not very much sought after, with the exception, and certainly the Dutch weren't sought after. What was sought after was French, because they had a certain amount of cachet, and Italian, and they were very cerebral. But the Dutch were plebeian. They were about things that you saw every day, and people and peasants and things like that. So they weren't collected in the United States, and the other 2 areas were a select group of people. Well, this exhibition traveled around, and then Frank did another exhibition at Clark Institute, and then at the National Gallery in Washington. We had a lot of things in that, and suddenly there seemed to be a lot more interest, and then other catalogs were published. But Wellesley started it all here, and that was 1969. That was 48 years ago, and we were in our 20s, and we were quite overwhelmed by the whole situation.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, Susan, so if we move to the other side of the equation, prints, so what inspired you to pursue a career as a prints dealer, and could you remember the first moment where you sort of really felt that that was the direction you wanted to go?
I do. I was getting my master's degree at the Institute of Fine Arts, and I don't know if it's still true, but then we had to write 2 qualifying papers. So we could go on and on and on. And I needed a job. I needed some cash to live on. And there was a little book in the office of mostly art dealers in the neighborhood who were looking for assistance. And the first person to respond to my inquiry was Paul McCarran, who was literally around the corner from the Institute on Madison Avenue and 78th Street. And I went up to meet with him, and he took a look at my very, very brief resume and saw that I was getting my master's and that I could read German and I could read French. And he said, okay, you'll do. I'll be back in 3 hours. I'm going to go view some auctions. And walked out the door. And I really didn't know what a print was. I had a vague notion. There were, actually the Institute and they did a project trying to photograph Bartsch, illustrated Bartsch. And so there was it was long before Barris. It was the college in London, and I'm blanking on the name.
Curatorial?
Yes, but the Whitman Library? Anyway,
Yeah.
not important. Those were the only prints I'd ever seen. They were photographs of prints. So I was left alone with these cabinets. He said, just take a look through and familiarize yourself. And I started opening drawers, and as you say, George, I pulled out a drawer, and there was a Rembrandt landscape that had once been a Sager's plate that Rembrandt had reworked, and there I was holding it in my hot little hands, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I was holding this thing that had been printed by Rembrandt. That just floored me. And I think maybe that's the gateway drug for people who love works of art on paper, that you can hold it in your hands. I had grown up going to museums every Sunday morning with my parents, but the holding was a brand new experience that was very compelling. And then I became a dealer when, as things often do in the art world, opportunity just flows your way. Paul McCarran was expert on an American printmaker named Martin Lewis, and someone walked in the door with half a dozen of his most expensive prints. And Paul was always short on cash. He was not a well-heeled dealer. And he looked at me and said, didn't Larry, who's my husband, my new husband, just get a bonus? And I said, yes. And he said, why don't you buy them? So I did. And then I would, when he did not have the cash and there was something that was really good that came down the pike, then I would buy it. And that went on for quite a long time.
You're not a dealer, you're a collector.
I always sold them, George. I collect ceramics. I don't compete with my clients. So, but that joy of holding is, I think, for prints and for drawings, just, there it is. We can have it here.
So Elizabeth, have you had that experience as well? Or can you speak to your first encounter?
Well, certainly the idea of holding the object and, turning it over, I think, that's sort of the print curator's disease. You want to see the other side, because it might have a collector's mark on it, it might have some other kind of mark. Sometimes it's just, almost every old master print seems like it has something, even if it's just like the catalog number of it. But that gives you a sense of something that, people talk about prints as being flat, but they really aren't. They have a kind of vivacity to them. So I think that excites me. But also my very first job, so I was a studio major as an undergraduate, so art history was kind of, I wasn't quite sure about that. But my first job was in the print department at the Metropolitan Museum, and I just remember so I had a lot of access I saw curators and I saw their jobs, and that seemed really fascinating. And I think I started thinking about what am I going to do besides being a receptionist or a secretary in this department. And I read a book by William Ivins, which talked very kind of iconoclastically about the history of art and how prints had made this huge impact, and not just on the history of art, but on the kind of history of the world. So talking about the Romans and the Egyptians didn't have printing; you couldn't have an exactly repeatable text or image, and what a revolution that was. And that kind of grabbed me into sort of took me into the print world. So I was surrounded by prints at the Met, so that kind of got me in there to thinking about a print or a drawing as this kind of something that you could hold and look at and examine from all different varieties. But then realizing that I didn't have to be a connoisseur kind of art historian, that I could actually go beyond art history and look at art from other directions. That really kind of is what got me here.
Well, I think the next topic that I would be interested in hearing from you all about is acquisitions, because certainly that's pretty critical in the equation of becoming a collector, and in collecting for for your own sort of gallery, for your own dealership, or for your museum. And so, George, I'm curious about sort of how you've gone about collecting. Have you collected primarily with dealers of drawings, or have you bought at auction? Have you done both? Do you choose a particular sort of form of acquisition based on medium? Because I know you also collect paintings as well. And so I'm just curious, how has that changed? And how, what is your approach?
Well, I was lucky. I had a partner in my wife, and we were both enthusiastic about it, so we didn't have any internal strife over putting money into it or traveling or that sort of thing. And we would travel together, but we did it, and it sounds like all of us did the same thing. We did a lot of scholarly work. We liked the scholarly side of collecting drawings and prints. We built a library. The library went from a few volumes to a few hundred, and now it has over 7,000 books and catalogs on Dutch art and related areas. We traveled to different museums, particularly in Europe. The British Museum has a wonderful print room, and you can ask for drawings to be brought to you, and you fill out a card and you say Rembrandt, and they bring you a box of Rembrandt drawings to look at. We did the same thing in the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre, and we learned about the art. So we really went at it from a scholarly point of view, but one of the interesting things, we did not limit who we bought from. Now, Ann Kirk came out of Wellesley, and she worked with dealers. And the collection shows it. We were looking at some of them. They're very good quality. She was not a specialist, as far as I can tell. And she bought quality prints. You're very lucky that this collection is coming here.
We think
and
so.
they cover the whole field of printmaking in some ways. And the result is that it's a comprehensive collection. That's not the way most collectors are. Most collectors find a passion, Italian drawings, French drawings, prints by Rembrandt, prints by Lewis. There's one collector who has a major collection in Connecticut. We collected drawings in all fields, but then narrowed down to the Dutch because we really liked them the best. And we needed to know enough so that we felt confident that we could make our own decisions. And so we would collect in all areas from a number of different dealers and at auction. There are some collectors who buy only at auction. They will have various reasons for that, or they don't want dealers to make a profit on them or something. But that's not my idea of the way to go. You've got to look in all sources and places. And some people become very close to dealers and will not buy at auction. They don't enjoy it. That's doable and makes a little more sense to me. But I think the collection that came here was bought almost all from dealers.
I don't think that I knew Anne from, I think, 1987. And I don't think that she ever bought at auction.
Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of reasons for that. I think because prints to her just related to her intellectual interests in literature, in painting and sculpture and other media. She was not a specialist, as you and your wife were, at all, as you can see. I mean, there were just things that sparked her interest in different directions. She also was living in Detroit and was often in pursuit of, she achieved several degrees, and I think pursued some others that she may not have finished, actually. Mary could tell you more about that. So she wasn't, frankly, as serious a collector as you were, but she was an extremely intelligent woman. And she happened to come into our gallery maybe a month after the only other Anne I've ever been friends with walked in with a stack of Dutch 16th century prints, Goltzius, Matham, De Geen III, and Anne was interested in these prints, Ann Warren, after Ann Baxter had delivered this batch. It was weird, actually, that this happened, asked for them, and I said, well, yes, we just happen to have acquired this group. Ann Warren was never really able to buy much more in that area, much as she wanted to, because at the same time, a very big dealer in New York, named Charles Hack, was starting to very voraciously collect Dutch 16th century prints, particularly Mannerist prints, in a very, very active way, really sucking the best material out of the market.
He still is.
And he still is. It's a phenomenal collection. It's, in some areas on par with the Rijksmuseum. Then he says, and I believe him, the National Gallery would compare any impression they were considering with what he had, because he really has such tremendously fine prints. So Anne would have loved to have developed that area. I think if there had been auctions with a really good chunk of material that I thought she could have bought, she could have actually developed into a more specialized collector, but she wasn't at the heart of the art market. You had greater proximity being in Boston, and also you had a wide circle of great dealers who were feeding wonderful drawings to you at a certain point.
Yeah.
I would think. So Anne, it was more casual. She was doing many other things in her life. It was one thing that she enjoyed.
Did she travel very extensively in Europe and elsewhere?
She went to England many times. I think she may have gone to, she went to Paris certainly, to Prague, but I would say probably went to Scandinavia once. Certainly not going, as we do, for seasons, for auctions and for exhibitions. She just didn't travel to that degree because she was often involved in academic programs. But in the summers, she would probably go to Europe, for 2 weeks this summer. But not enough, again, to build, it was not the primary center of her free time.
But she must have had a good relationship with you and trusted you.
She was a lovely woman, and I liked her enormously from the day that I met her. She, this is way to win a dealer's heart. She came in and went through drawers and just, and went through this group and just made a nice high stack. And she was my favorite person, But she continued to be so because she was just a really kind, warm, generous person. And I only ever wanted to sell her fine things. And which I began dealing with Carolyn Bullard unofficially in 1988 or so, when I had become a partner with Paul McCarran at that point. But Paul was he was underfunded, and he would buy opportunistically, and he was an artist himself, and had very interesting but basically very different tastes than mine. And Carolyn kept annoying me in the sale room when we would compete with each other, and so finally it occurred to us that maybe we should buy things in partnership, which we started doing in the 80s. And eventually in 98, we began dealing exclusively with each other. But I now have distracted myself from Anne.
Well, I have a quick question for you. Is sort of how do you go about acquiring prints to sell? And do you acquire with particular collectors in mind? Would you acquire something knowing that one of your clients, like Ann Kirk Warren, would have been particularly interested in that kind of material?
Most dealers find over time that is really not a good idea, because inevitably, even if the person really wants it, it's somehow a child's getting married, or there's a medical crisis, or they have suddenly it's a new day and they're interested in something else. So we try to buy things that we really believe in as art, and that we like the quality of the impression, and that we find the condition acceptable, because we're often dealing with very old objects and things will be compromised. We go to auctions, we have contacts with collections, and now I realized, you may not have been in the room, George, this afternoon, but I realized that I am now the age that Anne was when I met her 30 years ago. And she looked like an older lady. That was kind of distressing to realize. But we've gotten many collections back to sell that Carolyn began dealing a few years ahead of me. And we've had some really fine clients. But we do, yes, we play favorites. You know, we have favorite clients who we sell things that we really love to. And certain curators, you know, who want to come in early, Print Fair Week, are always welcome to come in early, Print Fair Week. And we love to sell things to museums, which really is putting us out of business, so it is a good thing that we're getting older. Because in the antiquarian market, and as you've seen this in the drawing market, they're just less, there's less and less and less, because American museums have been absorbing and absorbing and absorbing, and we have so many new museums in this country, and they've just been soaking up material since the Second World War like crazy. And it's just harder and harder to find wonderful things.
Interesting. Well, Elizabeth, on a different side of acquisitions, how do you go about acquiring from museums? And can you talk a little bit about what it was like to acquire for the New York Public Library versus acquiring for the Davis, an academic museum, versus the St. Louis Art Museum, sort of a larger civic museum?
So as one of the suckers of or someone who's responsible for that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of like my career because I've been at, you know, my very first job was at the Metropolitan Museum, where I didn't really acquire anything, but then I went to the New York Public Library, which was, you know, a massive research institution where, you know, I could sort of dig in the archives and the rare book section. And there I wasn't really responsible for you know, myself for acquiring works of art, but my opinion was, you know, listened to by my boss who did. And that was a collection that was very much like, actually the print collection within the New York Public Library was very much like a museum collection. So I think in some ways the choices were quite similar. I suppose that there might be, you know, prints that are more documentary in nature that I could easily propose at the New York Public Library that would be a little bit more difficult at the St. Louis Art Museum. So St. Louis Art Museum is a municipal museum that is very, very proud of the fact that they have a small but choice collection, and you know.
And you've got a good director who likes works of art.
And we have a good director who got his start in prints and drawings at the MFA in Boston, and who loves prints and appreciates that. So I've been very lucky to be supported in that. But whereas at New York Public Library, it was, you know, it would be fine to buy a print that only cost $5,000. In St. Louis, it's kind of, why aren't you buying a $500,000 print? And you know, I've been able to buy $500,000 prints in St. Louis, which I couldn't have bought at the library. So a little bit of it has to do with the price tag, and it also has to do with just thinking about the kind of institution and the kind of collection that it's looking for.
Well, I think my follow-up to this whole question of acquisitions is that there's inevitably one that got away or a couple that got away. I don't know, George, can you speak to any drawings that you were trying to acquire and somehow it eluded you?
I had a good friend who was a collector, famous collector, who used to say, every collector forms two collections. The one he or she formed and the one they might have formed. And in fact, you think back over many years, and I can remember when Rembrandt drawings that now would bring $3 or $4 million were selling for $25,000 or $30,000. I can remember discoveries that people made that I didn't make. On the other hand, I never tried to make discoveries because I found that was a quick way to make mistakes, to buy things that are almost right but really aren't, or that don't hold up, or that you really don't like. And I can name a number of things that I'm sorry I didn't get, but in looking at it, I think I bought more than I should have, from a sound point of view, more than I could afford. I a collector friend who always used to say he had more than he deserved, and I'm tempted to say that. And so I couldn't have done much more than I did do. It's just I might have done things a little differently at times.
Susan, can you think of an example?
Too many to enumerate. Because as a dealer, I don't get to keep it. And so Carolyn and I work backwards. We think, okay, we love this. This is fantastic. What is the top price that we can imagine asking for this object? And then we work our way backwards. And if it's a fantastic thing that we're absolutely insane about and we know that we can just make a tiny margin, like a large Degas for example, then we will go out there and just buy it. But there's a point where we have to stop because, as a dealer, a lot of dealers actually end their careers badly by buying so aggressively at the end when something fantastic comes along and they feel like I am senior, I have arrived, and that is mine. And then they actually financially tank themselves at the end of their careers. It's something that actually happens in all fields with remarkable regularity.
Collectors, too.
Yeah?
There are times when you say, my limit on this is X dollars, and when it's 3X, you're still bidding. It's the desire to possess something wonderful can overwhelm.
Something the moment just, I'm not 100% sure I should be telling this story, but I did just this week bid over $500,000 on a very, very important work of art for a client. It's never brought over $300,000 at auction, and actually with commissions it would have been about $650,000, our bid. I did say to him, I don't understand why this isn't a $1 million object or a $1.5 million object, and in fact it did sell for $1 million. But several months ago, a slightly lesser impression did sell for a record price of $300,000. So we're also living in a time when we're seeing, like as Elizabeth says, they want her to buy $500,000 prints. There weren't $500,000 prints until about 10 or 15 years ago, and then there were only a couple, big, important Picasso or Munch, but there was almost nothing. And that's changing.
There may be a misapprehension that we're contributing to here. There are lots of good prints that are not expensive.
There are lots of good prints that cost a couple of $100s.
And you can build a collection today if you work at it and think about it and don't have much money. You won't have the great Rembrandt unless something happens later in your life, but you can have a lovely collection of small, wonderful things. And it'd be a mistake to discourage Wellesley students, for instance, from thinking in terms of collecting. You don't have to buy 10 prints. You can buy 1 or 2 a year at $100 or $500 or $700. And at the end of 10 years, you'll look and see that you've got a group of things that you really love and that are quite wonderful. So we're talking in a different level than perhaps gives the total picture. The total picture is you can collect at a much lower level. You've got to think about it and work at it, but it can be a very exciting way to build a nice collection.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. That and there are print fairs. There's a print fair in New York every year. There are smaller print fairs in cities and towns across the country. So, there are places that you can go and see a wide variety of printed material. So it's kind of extraordinary. And if walking through the galleries at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston too, posters that people collected in the 60s, for rock concerts are actually now in museums too. So there's a sort of level, if you think about my William Ivins idea of prints not just being sort of amazing works of art in the moment. Those become kind of collectible things. So I think there's there's different kind of strata of collections. You can collect, and contemporary prints. You can collect prints of your friends in school that are not so expensive, but also kind of wonderful wonderful things. But I think the advantage of going to somewhere like a print fair is that you can compare, you can kind of walk from dealer to dealer. And I think it's also important, you know, I mean, there's one thing of an impulse buy to say, I love that thing and I really want it. And I think that's fine, that's a fine thing to do. But I think once you start doing more collecting, you want to think about what George was saying, is that you kind of study it. And you don't necessarily have to do that in an academic way, but I think dealers and collectors have a lot to say, and they've learned a lot. I mean, I've always been kind of amazed by the knowledge that dealers bring to what they do. It's, you know, it's what you all do for a living, and it's kind of extraordinary. So those people are resources. You have to remember that they're trying to sell what's in front of them. So, but you know, the advantage of going to a print fair example is that you can talk to 20 dealers, and you can get 20 different opinions. You know, they'll be interlacing, they'll interlock in various ways, but talking to people about what you're interested in and learning more about it, and then if you feel like it, you can go and read too. But I think learning, you know, you can buy what you like, but also learning about it can help a lot.
You know, and you can get help from curators like Elizabeth. One of their jobs is really to create and help collectors and hope that it ends up in their museum eventually. But if they do a really good job, they can help people in a wonderful way and, in fact, help the museum. It's great if a curator can create collectors. It's also great if a dealer can create collectors, because the urge to acquire requires you stepping over a line where you're not just an observer, you're an acquirer. And that's a hard line for a lot of people to step over. They need a good dealer or a good curator to help them step over that line. And after they've done that, it becomes easier. But you need somebody to help you in initial stages.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the challenges of collecting prints and drawings, is that, you know, prints and drawings are often grouped together, but they're actually very different types of art. You know, that drawings are unique, prints are multiples for the most part. You know, we're talking about something that is, you know, that has the artist potentially a preparatory drawing versus sort of a finished editioned image. And yet the thing that links them together is that they're all on paper, which is why we generally call them works on paper. And that is tricky because it means that they are light sensitive and fragile objects. And, you know, museums have major systems for sort of managing their print collections, which are usually, I mean, for the Davis Museum is quite deep. It's about half of our collection, our works on paper. And we certainly can't show them all at the same time because, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that they are light sensitive. So I wonder how you can sort of speak to sort of dealing with these works of art that are sort of have a fragility to them, you know, within the personal sort of private setting, within the setting of being a dealer and having to transport these objects, and then also sort of in the museum, and sort of how you're mindful of that and what that means. So George, if you could speak to that first. How do you manage your collection?
Well, you've got to worry about light and the fact that works of art on paper can fade. You've got to avoid direct sunlight. You've got to use special glass, and you've got to rotate the works of art. And after a while, you think about that, and you're careful. Print collectors and drawing collectors have what we call sonde boxes, and they're black boxes. All of you have probably seen them, and we put our works of art in there, and we close them, and sometimes you open them up and look at them, and other times you leave them packed away. There was a great drawing collector who used to loan his drawings everywhere, and I remember a woman came up to him. I was standing beside him. She said, "How can you stand to have your drawings either packed away or on exhibition far away from you?" And he looked at her and said, "Madam, they're all up here." And in fact, when you acquire things, there is something that registers in your mind, and you can go through them, you know exactly what they are and the details about them. And remember that. But you really have to be careful with works of art on paper. You can't get them wet. You can't get them in sunlight. And you got to be concerned. But people have been. 300, 400, 500 years, these things are still here, and often in good condition.
Well, partly because traditionally they were kept in albums,
Some of them.
which was the older form of the cylinder box, really.
I have an avocap which is still in its original frame from 1610,
Wow.
and it was hung. And the Dutch did hang some of their works that were made for that very purpose. But these works have survived. They're tougher than we think they are sometimes.
It's also well-made paper.
Yeah.
From
Well, when you're
cotton
talking
and linen
17th
fiber.
century, not so much with later 19th century
Right.
necessarily, or
Right.
20th century, that becomes a bigger problem.
Now, you did raise an important point. I think print collecting and drawing collecting are totally different. Drawing collectors often don't like prints at all. They don't like the fact that there are multiples and that somebody else may have a better impression. Whereas the drawings are unique, and you know that they're unique to that artist, and they're sort of even more personal than prints. I don't like the idea of a print and a machine and ink and all sorts of things going in.
Okay, we're going to have this out, George.
But
Because
print people really do love that.
Listen, someone else may have the stronger landscape, or the stronger portrait, or the better preserved similar drawing. So you get into comparisons that we struggle with. And with older prints also, they're often, the more you look at prints, actually, especially when you're talking pre-modern times, the more individualized you often see those impressions as. And you have to go see the Sager show at the Met if you want
I
to see.
know the show very well. I saw
Really,
it in there, yeah.
okay. So you saw it in Amsterdam. So really individualized impressions. So I know you're speaking in generalities, but I do think that we share more of the same concerns.
I want to be specific. I don't know whether I've got the patience to distinguish a seventh from a fifth state of a particular print, or have an interest in
Well, I'll
that.
tell you why that's interesting, though.
Well, I know for
Okay,
some
well,
people.
no, the reason it's interesting, for example, with Rembrandt, what we want to see, and what the only types of Rembrandt that we will buy, and we had a number to show you this week, are impressions that were printed by Rembrandt.
During his lifetime. yeah.
During his lifetime. So determining that this is what the artist saw is the most important thing to us. And of course, then that also correlates strongly with the value of the object. But we want to see the print as Rembrandt, who valued printmaking just as he valued his drawings and his paintings as an art form. So we want to see it the way that he saw it. The problem is they got printed for hundreds of years. Many of his plates were printed
I have
for
3
hundreds of years
plates
and
from
then-
Rembrandt that were worked over.
Right, so once they're worked over, it's someone else's hand.
I have the original plates he worked on.
Yes, I have the one that's on the back of the catalog, which I bought because it was not worked over. So, we have our own notions about, and to me, that was as close as I was ever going to come to having a Rembrandt drawing, actually, because he drew and bid it, and this particular one never was reworked. So that had value to me.
I think prints and drawings are kind of different animals too, because part of the beauty of a drawing is it's the immediacy of the artist's hand on that sheet of paper that you have, whereas with the print, the immediacy of the artist's hand is in the matrix. So it's a sculpture, that the artist makes that then gets inked and put through a press. And with Rembrandt, the beauty of that is that he's also there very much in inking and making them each one have its own kind of individual characteristic. But to me, that's sort of it's someone who wants the spontaneity of a drawing or the directness of a drawing, maybe isn't going to want that indirect process where you get the print and it's the matrix, and then the print that you get is in the reverse direction, and it's a different animal. But I look at a print, I look at an engraving, and I think, oh my God, this is a relief sculpture because the ink really stands on top of the paper. That's kind of a geeky print person's idea, but I think different kinds of people respond to that. I mean, I think someone who says, I want to have the one and that's the only one and it's the direct thing, maybe is going to have a harder time with the thing that is a multiple, whereas, I'm fascinated by the multiple side of
You
it.
two can answer a question for me. I don't collect prints, but I happen to have a lot of prints. I put together a complete set of prints by Cornelius Beger. He did 36. He really did 38 because I found 2 others that he had done that aren't recorded. And I have this wonderful group, every one of them. I didn't pay attention to whether they were brilliant first impressions or not. I paid attention to the fact you couldn't find them. And I wanted to have every one that he did, and I got some of them in multiple states. Some people would say that that's not interesting, because some of those prints, there's much better examples or earlier prints. But I have a perfect set. It was exhibited at the National Gallery in Berlin and in Aachen and elsewhere as a set because of the images. And I was interested in the images and not the perfect impression. Is that a mistake?
Well, it depends on your mission. I assume that you did that because you had drawings by Vega, and so you were interested in what else he created. I would say it doesn't make it less interesting, it only makes it less monetarily valuable.
Well, I didn't care about that.
Right. So, no, it's interesting because you expanded your knowledge, as you say, now in your eyes. You own those etchings, which he drew into the matrix to create them. So it's more of his hand in your mind's eye of how Vega drew.
A serious print person, it might be unsettling to see of the 36, 30 that are very good examples and 6 that aren't. And the exhibition would be spoiled.
I've never seen all 36 together. I didn't
No,
see that
nobody's-
exhibition at the National Gallery, so to me, that's a very cool thing. But yes, would I like them all to be blazing first impressions? Of course. But I would still find it fascinating to see all of his prints.
I think there are different, it's 2 questions. One is there are different kinds of collectors. So in St. Louis, I've worked with 2 different kinds. One is someone who wanted every print and every state of one particular category, just really wanted to do everything to be able to show all of the publishers that own that plate. Another is someone who wanted like the most extraordinary collection, most extraordinary impression of Rembrandt's 100 Guilder print that he could find, and that's what he found. And the collection is filled with beautiful impressions of textbook examples of prints by the greatest individuals who engaged with printmaking. But I think part of it is there are just different kind of collectors, and some people want everything, and some people want just a really choice, sort of choice example of that. And I think the other thing is just that rarity thing. Like if you want everything, you at least went to the point of getting 30 of them or 33 of them in very good impressions, and then you wanted to have all of them to be able to show that, and you couldn't get them, and you got yeah. And I think you mentioned that earlier, that these things are hundreds of years old. And sometimes there are some things you're never going to get simply because the one impression is in a museum somewhere. There are other things that you have to choose. If you say I want a Rembrandt, I only want to pay $1,200, and therefore you're going to get a really lousy late impression.
Then you should just get a really good photograph of a really beautiful impression. Because if it's not the artist's intention, I mean, you had an academic interest for Vega, for assembling those prints, to accompany your drawings. You weren't being a print collector and assembling that group.
No,
It was auxiliary to drawings.
I'm not sure I wanted them to accompany the drawings. I like the drawings better.
Well, but it was part of your interest in Vega.
Not my interest. I've got
Right,
2 paintings
right.
by him.
Otherwise, you want the prints to look the way the artist intended them to look, which as the plate square, if the artist himself doesn't refresh the plate, then it becomes something else by someone else, the publisher who next handles and prints the plate.
Well, that's why I don't collect prints.
Well, my last question I had for all of you is that I want to know sort of what about sort of living with works on paper brings you the most joy. And for you, George, I mean, there's so many ways in which you've lived with your collection. Is it the thrill of the hunt? Is it having these drawings in your collection? Your collections have gone all around the world. I know, what inspires you to keep collecting, and what makes you truly love collecting?
Well, there certainly is a thrill of the hunt, and that exists for any collector. But, and I mentioned the collector whose collection is in his head, and that's another thing that collectors have. But there's something wonderful. I think of a Sunday morning and going into my living room, and around there are drawings and sculpture and paintings, and I can sit there, and it's a special feeling. It's different than anything else I could ever do. So I think it's a combination of those things, really. The thrill of the hunt, and if the hunt is successful, the love of what you acquired, and how it fits into your life and affects the way you feel. And that's why I think if I would advise anybody who was at Wellesley or graduating, I would say think about being a collector. It's a great, great way to enjoy an aspect of your life.
Susan?
Well, I'm only a custodial owner of the prints that I buy and sell with Carolyn. So my prints live in a print cabinet, and because we sell probably, it used to be 90%, it's less now. We actually seem to have acquired a bunch of very, very good private collectors, most of whom who are associated with museum collections, and their prints will ultimately go to museum collections, and they get advice from people such as Elizabeth on how to shape their collections. But so I keep everything in a print cabinet, and I never want to use up exhibition time for the work on paper before we sell it. So I literally never hang a print in my home.
But what is the joy that you find in the work that you do?
Still, and just holding it in my hand. So, when we do sell to private people, I have a bit of a good news, bad news speech, which is that the bad news is that you cannot expose this to light endlessly. You have to put clips on the back of your frames. You have to rotate out your collection. You have to be very, if you can afford to put filtered glass in your exterior windows, that's great. But you certainly have to put museum glass on the frames of the things that you're going to hang at all. But the good news is you get cylinder boxes, and you keep things in cylinder boxes, and you take them out and you hold them in your hands and look at them, not through glass, but right in front of your eyes, which is just an endless joy to me.
Elizabeth?
So I think I don't own any, I don't buy them for myself. I recommend to my museum director that this is something that should go into the collection. And I enjoy having that, that access to them. I mean, when a dealer comes or when I go to the print fair, just to be able to look at prints and sort of think about whether it is what it should be. Is it what the artist intended? Is it not such a great impression? That's not always so easy to figure out. So I kind of like that kind of search for that. But then once it's in the museum, I love sharing it. So, I've always worked at an institution where there was a study room that people, individuals and groups, come in to look at them. So, it's kind of wonderful to be able to do that. I spent a lovely morning in your galleries this morning and looked at several things, things from the prints and drawings collection that are here, a few of which I had a hand in acquiring for the museum. So that to me is a tremendous joy.
Well, then I think sort of in conclusion, we have George, who's a collector of drawings, and Susan, who's a dealer of prints. Elizabeth, you are the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs. So what's the answer? Prints, drawings, or photographs?
Why choose?
Yeah, well, they're all my favorite children, of course. I have no favorites. But I think I do, partly because of starting in, I would have to say prints in a way, but it was the kind of the beginning of my career, learning about that. But as an art studio major, I certainly would have said drawings, probably. So have a little, there's a little piece of me for everything, even photographs.
That's what makes her such a good curator.
Well, that's the thing about curating in general. You don't have to choose. You can kind of just love all of these objects. Well, I want to just give you a few moments to see if there's any questions in the audience before we conclude. Does anyone have a question for any of our panelists?
I have a question. Mr. Abrams, are you as passionate about collecting now as you ever were? Do you still collect? Do you still search for things and hunt for things and get excited about finding new Dutch treasures, or has it waned a bit?
I collect always, as I always did. And when I won't be doing that, I won't be around. No, I still add things. I try to improve the collection. There's a group that we've given to Harvard. It amounts to about 140 really good drawings of the period from Rembrandt and others. I have another group, 200, over at the Museum of Fine Arts on loan. And I try to look at it as a total collection. I've got many more at home. But I try to add where it needs strengthening, or where there are things that come along that would make the collection better. Where it all ends up, I haven't totally worked out yet, but I'm working on it. But I think the most fun I have is thinking about the next acquisition. Not the last one, the next one.
For us too, it's the thrill of the hunt also.
Yeah.
I mean, we love to see things that we've never seen before. That's one of the big joys.
Yeah.
If you've been doing it as long as we have, to see a print that we've never seen before, or an impression that we've never seen of a print, it's wonderful.
Well, that's
That
where I
gets
have a little,
exciting.
that's where I have a little bit of a problem, because I guess I'm looking for a complete picture, and the impressions, the different impressions in Rembrandt is particularly important. In Ostad, sometimes in other people, but that's not where I want to go. I want to go to original drawings that you don't worry about the individual impression. But you made the argument the other way, and I thought it was effective.
We enjoy the steep learning curve.
Attribution in drawings is a pickle.
Drawings frighten people, and that's why there are not many collectors. If you're a young collector and you're out looking at drawings, some dealers are responsible and a number aren't. Now it's much better, but in the old days, everything was Rembrandt or Goldsmith or big names, and they weren't. And you get burned once or twice, and you decide you might as well do something else. So a lot of collectors are driven away by that. But people are more responsible. The auction houses are more responsible now, and dealers are more responsible.
I've had experts in Dutch drawings, as it happens, sit in my living room and argue, well-respected people with very large jobs in the museum world, and completely different opinions as to attribution. And as a dealer, if I assign a value based on something being actually by Goldsmith, I take the responsibility to my debt that it is what I had sold it as. With prints, I feel confident that my scholarship is good enough to warrant that. And I actually have never had to make a refund.
With
drawings, it's terrifying.
There are currently 5 really good scholars on Rembrandt drawings. 1 in Britain, 1 in Holland, 1 used to be in Cambridge, now in California, 1 in Berlin, and another here. They will often agree. 2 of them will disagree more often than others. And you will often get a split that's 3-2. The difference in value is so large you'd be terrified. You hope that you're on the right end of where they think things are. But that is the fear of somebody who spends a great deal of money on a Rembrandt drawing, and one of the scholars writes an article, he might put a footnote in saying this isn't by Rembrandt, it's by Willem Drost. And it affects the market. The answer is you either don't buy those or you don't worry about the market. You intend to keep them and give them to a museum. And you're willing to use your own judgment and have your own views and satisfied that you've got something you want. And that's just a way you can live with it. Some people can't, and they don't get into the field, or they get out of it quickly.
I think we had one more question, and then I think we can adjourn to the reception.
I was going to ask about the role of the internet in your various pursuits. I mean, I think I would say we've had about 15 years of a mature enough internet, you know, where there's actual content to look at in every field, that it probably has come to bear in what you pursue. I mean, how do you use the internet with your?
You know, that's a very good question, because it is affecting collecting in every area. It used to be, I mean, the book area is a great example, rare books. It used to be that it was difficult to know what was being offered on the market because they were offered in specific locations and places. Now, with the internet, you can know pretty much every auction sale, where works of art that you might be interested in are being sold, estimates. You can look up details about that artist or information about what museums have. There's a tremendous amount of information there. It's very hard to buy, I think, not having seen the original work of art. You don't get a feel for how it fits with the paper, the effect of the paper. This deals with works of art on paper. And so while your knowledge increases, and while your scholarly knowledge of what's available, what's in different places, and what museums have increases, and it's easier to get to it, you still have to think about seeing the work of art and making a decision when you see it, rather than buying it on the internet. That's my experience. I don't know, with prints, it's different a little bit.
No, we want to see pretty much everything that we buy. With rare exceptions, we will sometimes have friends who we consider very knowledgeable and highly skilled, and whose opinion we trust, answer our long checklist of questions. If there's just one thing coming up in London that's of interest to us and we don't want to make the trip, for example. But it is great because you do know about all kinds of small auctions that might, rural, remote auctions in the south of France or wherever that, you would have just missed before. And dealers there used to be just the season, and you'd go for the French sales and the English sales and the German sales and the Swiss sales, and you'd stay a very long time. It was very expensive, frankly, very hard on families. It was, just a lot of travel. And now it's easier. First of all, there aren't as many sales worth going for, but it's easier to really take a good hard look. And it's also easier to get people to take JPEGs and to email those to you. And to do a lot of legwork before you commit to going over and viewing it in person. So that's hugely helpful. I would never buy anything on eBay. I know dealers that do, and I actually know curators that do, but I would never. So much as how is the ink sitting on the surface. At the level that we're trying to buy at for museum collections and for the most discerning collectors, it all matters so much. Even if something's a little bit overcleaned, then it will diminish the value or just make it completely unappetizing to us. So, but for just the information that we can glean, sitting in our bathrobe and drinking a coffee, it's unbelievable. It's great. And frankly, we can also bid online, although we choose to bid by phone if we can't be in the room. But lots of dealers I know also bid online. And again, you don't have to be away so long, so that's also a good thing.
It is a bit of a trap, though, because some smart dealers will put a good drawing, for instance, at a remote French auction. And they will know that people will be looking, and they will find it, and somehow or other, when they're estimated at 800 euro, and they suddenly reach 180,000 euro, you know they've been successful. And that happens more than you think right now.
And with prints as well. Things turn up in little remote auctions up in Maine that were formerly in the New York Gallery.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have so much to add, except that it is amazing, the information, and that also I still need to see the actual object. Because a photograph, a high resolution digital photograph gives you a tremendous amount of information, but if you haven't seen the actual thing, you can't tell exactly what you're looking at.
But for
So,
research, to go to the
Yeah.
websites of
Yeah, that's
museums
extraordinary.
is incredibly useful for everyone interested in prints and drawings. I mean, just to go and see the holdings, and then again, I should make a trip there. I really need to see this in person. Or sometimes the photographs are really such high quality that you can tell what it is you're looking for to determine the state.
Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists, and you'll go across the way to the Davis Museum's lobby, and we can sort of ask further questions of the panelists if you have them. So thank you all.